Picture this. A 16-year-old girl pedaling her bicycle down a familiar gravel road on an autumn evening. The sun hasn't set yet. She's thinking about homework, about weekend plans, about her future. In less than 1 hour, she will vanish completely, leaving behind only her bicycle and a mystery that will haunt an entire community for nearly 20 years. This is the story of Abigail Rose Kincaid, known to everyone as Abby. In 2004, she disappeared from a rural Illinois road she'd traveled hundreds of times before. What happened to her became one of the state's most baffling cold cases, a mystery that seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. But cold cases have a way of coming back to life when science catches up with crime. In 2024, DNA technology that didn't exist when Abby vanished finally revealed her killer's identity, hidden in microscopic traces on a torn sweater recovered 20 years earlier. The arrest would shock the entire community, because the person responsible had been living among them all along, hidden in plain sight, his secret buried for 2 decades. This is a story about a family that refused to give up, about evidence that waited patiently for technology to unlock its secrets, and about how justice, though delayed by 20 years, never truly forgets. This is the solved case of Abigail Kincaid. Let me introduce you to Abby Kincaid. 16 years old in the autumn of 2004. A high school junior with strawberry blonde hair she usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, freckles across her nose from summers spent outdoors, and a smile that her teachers would later describe as genuinely warm and curious. Abby grew up in the heart of rural Illinois, in a small farming community where everyone knew everyone, where front doors stayed unlocked, and where the biggest traffic concern was getting stuck behind a slow-moving tractor on the county roads. Her family's property sat on the edge of town, surrounded by cornfields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The landscape was flat, punctuated only by grain silos, farmhouses, and the occasional windbreak of trees. She was the middle child of 3, sandwiched between an older brother who'd recently left for college and a younger sister still in middle school. Her father worked as a mechanic at the local co-op. Her mother managed the office at the grain elevator. They weren't wealthy, but they were stable, rooted in that particular kind of American rural life where community ties run deep and generations stay close to home. But Abby had different dreams. She wanted out, not because she didn't love her family or her town, but because she wanted more. She devoured books, particularly stories set in big cities or foreign countries. Her bedroom walls were covered with college brochures. University of Illinois, Northwestern, even a few from out of state, schools with strong journalism programs because Abby wanted to be a reporter, wanted to tell stories that mattered, wanted to see the world beyond the cornfields. Her English teacher, Mrs. Patricia Henderson, would later tell investigators that Abby was one of those students who made teaching worthwhile. She asked questions that made you think, Patricia recalled. She didn't just want to know what happened in a story. She wanted to know why. She wanted to understand motivations, consequences, the human element behind everything. Abby worked part-time at the town library, shelving books and helping with the after-school reading program for younger kids. The head librarian, Margaret Foster, remembered her as responsible and thoughtful. Abby never missed a shift, Margaret said. If she said she'd be there, she'd be there. That's why when she didn't come home that night, her parents knew immediately something was wrong. Outside of school and work, Abby was active in her church youth group and played clarinet in the school band. Not particularly well, she joked to friends, but with enthusiasm. She loved animals, particularly the barn cats that lived in the equipment shed behind her family's house. She'd named every single one of them and could tell you each cat's personality quirks and favorite hiding spots. Her best friend since elementary school was a girl named Rachel Winters, whose family owned a farm about 3 miles from the Kincaid property. The two were inseparable, spending countless hours together, sharing secrets and dreams the way teenage girls do. They'd ride their bicycles back and forth between each other's houses all the time, following the network of gravel roads that connected the scattered farmsteads. That bicycle, a blue mountain bike with a white basket attached to the handlebars, was Abby's primary mode of transportation. In rural Illinois in 2004, not every 16-year-old had access to a car, and Abby was still months away from getting her driver's license. But she didn't mind. She liked the independence of the bike, the freedom to come and go as she pleased, the quiet time alone with her thoughts as she pedaled through the countryside. On the afternoon of October 16, 2004, a Saturday, Abby told her mother she was riding over to Rachel's house to work on a school project. They had a history presentation due the following week. Her mother, Linda Kincaid, reminded her to be home before dark. Abby promised she would be. It was a conversation that would replay in Linda's mind thousands of times over the coming years, searching for any detail she might have missed, any warning sign she should have noticed. But there was nothing unusual about that day. Nothing that stood out. Just an ordinary Saturday in an ordinary small town, with an ordinary teenage girl heading to her best friend's house to work on homework. Abby kissed her mother goodbye, grabbed her backpack, wheeled her bike out of the garage, and pedaled away down the long driveway. Her younger sister, Emma, who was 11 at the time, watched from the living room window as Abby disappeared down the road. She was wearing her favorite hoodie, Emma would later remember, the gray one with the purple stripes, and she waved at me before she turned onto the county road. That was the last time I saw her. At Rachel's house, the two girls spent the afternoon spread out on the Winters family's living room floor, surrounded by poster board, markers, and printouts about the Civil War. Rachel's mother, Susan Winters, brought them snacks and lemonade. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. Around 5:30 in the evening, Abby started packing up her things. The sun was getting lower, and she wanted to get home before dark like she'd promised. Rachel walked her out to the driveway, and the two stood talking for another 10 minutes the way teenagers do, drawing out goodbyes, squeezing in just a few more stories, a few more laughs. She seemed happy. Rachel would tell police later, her voice breaking. She was talking about this college fair coming up at school. She was excited about it. There was nothing wrong. Nothing at all. At approximately 5:50 p.m., Abby Kincaid climbed onto her blue bicycle and pedaled away from the Winters farmhouse. The route home was straightforward, 3 miles along familiar gravel roads she'd traveled alone countless times before. The October evening was cool but pleasant, that perfect autumn weather when the harvest is nearly done and the air smells like dried corn stalks and distant with smoke. Rachel watched her friend ride away until Abby disappeared around a curve, blocked by a stand of trees. That was the last confirmed sighting of Abigail Kincaid alive. The 3-mile journey should have taken Abby about 15 to 20 minutes. By 6:30, when she still hadn't arrived home, her mother began to worry. By 7 o'clock, with darkness falling and still no sign of her daughter, Linda Kincaid's worry transformed into something deeper, colder, more primal. She called the Winters house. Susan Winters confirmed that Abby had left nearly an hour earlier. That's when Linda Kincaid called the police. The first call came into the county sheriff's office at 7:14 p.m. on October 16, 2004. Deputy Tom Brennan took the report from a frantic mother reporting her 16-year-old daughter missing. In a small rural community, missing person calls weren't uncommon. Teenagers staying out past curfew, kids losing track of time. But something about Linda Kincaid's voice made Brennan pay attention. "This isn't like her," Linda kept saying. "Abby doesn't do this. Something's wrong. I can feel it." Deputy Brennan didn't dismiss her concerns. He'd been working in this county long enough to know that when a parent says something is wrong, you listen. He immediately dispatched patrol units to search the route between the Winters farm and the Kincaid property. David Kincaid, Abby's father, had already jumped in his truck and was driving the route himself, scanning the ditches, looking for any sign of his daughter. His mind was racing through possibilities. Maybe she'd had an accident. Maybe she'd fallen off her bike and was hurt. Maybe she'd stopped somewhere and lost track of time. But even as he tried to convince himself of these rational explanations, a knot of dread was forming in his stomach. The gravel roads that connected these farmsteads were designated county roads. But they were remote, rarely traveled after dark, bordered on both sides by agricultural fields. There were no streetlights, no houses visible from most stretches of the road. During harvest season, you might encounter farm equipment, but on a Saturday evening in mid-October, with most of the harvest already in, these roads would be nearly deserted. At 7:43 p.m., Deputy Brennan's spotlight swept across something blue in the ditch along County Road 18 North. He stopped his patrol car, got out, and there it was. Abby's bicycle, lying on its side in the shallow ditch, about 1.5 miles from the Winters farm. The bike appeared to have been thrown or dropped rather than carefully placed. The front wheel was bent, the basket partially detached. Brennan immediately called it in and secured the area. This was no longer a teenager who'd lost track of time. This was a potential crime scene. Within 30 minutes, multiple law enforcement units converged on the location. Illinois State Police were notified. More deputies arrived. David Kincaid pulled up in his truck, saw his daughter's bicycle in the ditch, and the terrible truth began to sink in. Something bad had happened to Abby. As investigators examined the scene in the beams of their flashlights, several details emerged. There were tire tracks in the soft gravel shoulder, not bicycle tire tracks but vehicle tracks, suggesting a car or truck had pulled over at this exact spot. There were scuff marks in the gravel, patterns that suggested some kind of struggle or sudden movement. And then they found the sweater. About 15 feet from where the bicycle lay, partially hidden in the tall grass at the edge of a soybean field, investigators discovered a piece of torn fabric. It was gray with purple stripes, the distinctive hoodie Abby had been wearing when she left home that afternoon. But it wasn't intact. A section of the left sleeve had been torn away, ripped violently, the fabric shredded as if someone had grabbed it forcefully. Sergeant Michael Torres of the Illinois State Police carefully bagged the evidence, recognizing its potential importance. There were what appeared to be biological stains on the fabric, though in the darkness it was impossible to tell what they might be. Blood? Sweat? Something else? The torn sweater would be sent to the state crime lab for analysis. But Abby herself was nowhere to be found. Search and rescue teams were mobilized immediately. By midnight, over 100 volunteers from the community were combing the fields and ditches along every road in the area. They searched through the night, calling Abby's name, sweeping flashlight beams across acres of harvested corn stubble and standing soybeans. The Kincaid family's church organized a prayer vigil. The high school principal opened the building and turned it into a volunteer coordination center. Local farmers drove their tractors along field edges, checking irrigation ditches and equipment sheds. It was the kind of all-hands response that happens in small communities when one of their own is in danger. But as the night wore on with no sign of Abby, the unspoken fear that everyone was thinking became harder to ignore. The bicycle, the torn sweater, the remote location. These weren't the signs of a runaway teenager or a simple accident. These were the signs of something far more sinister. By dawn on October 17th, the search had expanded to include neighboring counties. Helicopters with infrared cameras flew grid patterns over the agricultural landscape. Dive teams checked farm ponds and drainage ditches. Cadaver dogs worked the roadsides and field edges. Nothing. No trace of Abigail Kincaid beyond that bicycle and that torn piece of her sweater. The community was in shock. This kind of thing didn't happen here. Sure, you heard about abductions and missing children on the news, but that was always somewhere else. Big cities, distant places. Not here in the heart of rural Illinois, where everyone knew everyone and people trusted their neighbors. Rachel Winters was devastated, racked with guilt. If only she'd driven Abby home instead of letting her ride her bike. If only she'd insisted Abby leave earlier. If only. Her parents tried to comfort her, but Rachel would struggle with those thoughts for years. At the Kincaid household, time seemed to stop. Linda sat by the phone, jumping every time it rang, hoping for news, dreading what that news might be. David couldn't sit still, constantly pacing, driving the roads again and again, unable to accept that his daughter had simply vanished. The younger sister, Emma, barely spoke. She'd overheard enough adult conversations to understand that something terrible had happened to Abby, even if no one would explain the details to her 11-year-old understanding. The older brother, Jason, rushed home from college, feeling helpless and angry. He joined the search teams, walking miles of ditches and field edges, his eyes scanning every inch of ground, looking for any clue that might bring his sister home. The media descended quickly. By the second day, News vans from Springfield and even Chicago were parked in the town, covering the story of the missing teenager. Abby's junior year school photo, the one where she's smiling, wearing a blue sweater, her strawberry blonde hair pulled back, was broadcast across Illinois and beyond. Tips started coming in. Someone thought they'd seen a blue bicycle. Someone else reported a suspicious vehicle. Each lead was investigated thoroughly, but none of them led anywhere. The physical evidence remained stubbornly limited. One bicycle, one torn sweater, tire tracks in the gravel, and an empty stretch of rural road where Abby Kincaid had simply ceased to exist. The initial 72 hours after a disappearance are considered critical. After 72 hours, the statistics become grim. And as day 3 turned into day 4, even the most optimistic members of the search team had to confront the reality that they were probably no longer looking for a rescue. They were looking for a recovery. The question that haunted everyone was simple and terrible. What happened to Abby Kincaid on that October evening? Who took her, and where was she now? Detective Lieutenant James Holbrook of the Illinois State Police Major Case Squad took over the investigation on day 5. A 20-year veteran with experience in complex cases, Holbrook understood that the window for finding Abby alive was rapidly closing, but he also knew that every detail mattered, that somewhere in the evidence and witness statements was the thread that would unravel this mystery. His first step was to reconstruct Abby's final journey with minute precision. The route from the Winters farm to the Kincaid home followed County Road 18 north for approximately 2.5 miles, then turned east on County Road 450 for the final half-mile. The bicycle had been found on County Road 18 north, about 1.5 miles from the starting point, meaning Abby had covered roughly 60% of her journey before something interrupted it. Holbrook assembled a timeline. Rachel Winters stated Abby left her house at approximately 5:50 p.m. The discovery of the bicycle occurred at 7:43 p.m. That meant Abby had been missing for nearly 2 hours before anyone even knew there was a problem. In those 2 hours, whoever took her had a massive head start. The detective focused on the physical evidence. The torn sweater was sent to the Illinois State Police Forensic Science Center in Springfield. DNA testing in 2004 was significantly less sophisticated than it would become in later years, but forensic scientists did what they could. They identified several substances on the fabric. Abby's own DNA from skin cells and hair, soil consistent with the ditch where it was found, and what appeared to be a small amount of biological material that didn't match Abby's profile. This foreign DNA was collected and preserved, but the sample was minuscule, just a few microscopic cells, possibly from sweat or skin oil. The technology in 2004 simply couldn't generate a full DNA profile from such a limited sample. The genetic material was carefully stored in evidence, but it couldn't immediately identify a suspect. The tire tracks at the scene were photographed and cast in plaster. Analysis suggested they came from a pickup truck or SUV with all-terrain tires, a common vehicle type in rural farming communities. Thousands of such vehicles existed in the county alone. Holbrook's team conducted intensive interviews with every person who lived or worked along that route. In rural Illinois, farmsteads might be a quarter-mile apart or more, meaning there weren't that many potential witnesses. But each one was questioned thoroughly. Harold Jameson, age 62, who farmed a section of land about a half-mile from where the bicycle was found, told investigators he'd been working in his barn that evening and hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. His property sat back from the road, partially hidden by trees, and he said he wouldn't necessarily have noticed a vehicle passing by. Kenneth Mills, 38, who lived in a trailer on leased farmland closer to the scene, said he'd been inside watching television and hadn't heard anything. He drove a pickup truck with all-terrain tires, as did about half the men in the county. Police searched his property with his consent, finding nothing suspicious. Thomas Dwyer, 51, who operated a grain storage facility about a mile south of the scene, told investigators he'd left work around 5:30 and driven home on a different road, never passing the location where Abby disappeared. Gary Thornton, 44, a long-haul truck driver who was renting a farmhouse with his wife about 2 miles from the scene, said he'd been on the road that weekend, hauling a load to Indiana, and didn't return home until Sunday. His wife confirmed his absence. Every male resident within a 5-mile radius was interviewed. Every vehicle was documented. Everyone's alibis were checked and rechecked. Holbrook was thorough and methodical, knowing that in cases like this, the perpetrator was often someone familiar to the victim, someone who lived or worked nearby, someone whose presence wouldn't seem out of place on that rural road. But week after week, the investigation hit dead ends. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. The forensic evidence pointed to an abduction, but there wasn't enough to identify a specific suspect. The state crime lab attempted to enhance the DNA profile from the torn sweater multiple times, running different testing protocols, but the sample was simply too small, too degraded, to yield the full genetic markers needed for a database comparison. They could tell it was male DNA, but that was about it. Millions of men fit that description. Holbrook expanded the investigation beyond the immediate area. He looked at registered sex offenders in central Illinois, checking their locations and alibis for October 16th. He investigated recent releases from state prisons, looking for anyone with a history of violence against women or children who might have been in the area. He examined similar unsolved cases in neighboring states, looking for patterns. One particularly promising lead emerged when a woman in a town 40 miles away reported seeing a teenage girl matching Abby's description in a gas station on October 17th, the day after the disappearance. Investigators followed up aggressively, pulling security camera footage, interviewing the station attendants. But the girl in the video turned out to be a local teenager who just happened to resemble Abby. Another dead end. As October turned into November, and November into December, the investigation continued, but with diminishing returns. Leads dried up. The media attention moved on to other stories. The search teams disbanded. Life in the small Illinois town slowly, reluctantly, returned to a semblance of normalcy, though nothing would ever truly be normal again. The Kincaid family couldn't move on. How could they? Their daughter was still missing. Every day that passed without answers was another day of torture. Linda Kincaid, in particular, struggled to function. She'd taken leave from her job at the grain elevator. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, spent hours staring at Abby's bedroom, which remained exactly as it had been on October 16th. By early 2005, Detective Holbrook had exhausted his immediate leads. The case wasn't officially closed. Missing person cases are never truly closed. But it became inactive. The evidence boxes were stored. The file was marked cold. Abby Kincaid joined the ranks of missing persons whose fates remain unknown, whose families remain in limbo, suspended between hope and grief. But Holbrook never forgot about Abby. He kept her case file at the front of his cabinet. Every few months he'd pull it out, review the evidence, look for something he might have missed. He attended conferences on cold case investigations, learning about new techniques and technologies. He kept in touch with Linda Kincaid, calling her periodically to let her know that Abby hadn't been forgotten. The torn sweater with its microscopic DNA sample remained in evidence storage at the state crime lab, preserved carefully, waiting for technology to catch up, waiting for science to advance enough to unlock the secrets held in those few cells. In 2004, those cells couldn't tell investigators anything useful. But DNA technology was advancing rapidly. What was impossible in 2004 might be routine by 2010, or 2015, or 2020. The evidence was waiting. The case was waiting. Justice was waiting. And though no one knew it yet, the killer was waiting too. Living his life, feeling safe, believing that enough time had passed, that he'd gotten away with it. 20 years is a long time. Long enough to relax. Long enough to think the past is truly buried. But the past has a way of coming back. And in cold cases, nothing stays buried forever. The years after Abby's disappearance were marked by an aching absence that never diminished. For the Kincaid family, time didn't heal. It just stretched out the pain, made it a permanent part of their existence, something they learned to carry but never learned to bear. Linda Kincaid became a woman possessed by a single mission: finding out what happened to her daughter. She threw herself into understanding cold cases, studying them obsessively, connecting with other families of missing children, learning everything she could about investigation techniques, evidence preservation, and the legal system. She assembled what she called the Abby Binder, a meticulous, constantly updated collection of every document, photo, news article, tip, and piece of information related to her daughter's disappearance. The binder grew to 3 volumes, hundreds of pages organized with tabs and notes, cross-references and timelines. Linda carried it with her everywhere. Every year on October 16th, the anniversary of Abby's disappearance, Linda organized a vigil at the site where the bicycle had been found. The community attended faithfully at first. Dozens of people standing in the autumn darkness, holding candles, praying, remembering. But as years passed, attendance dwindled. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. People moved on with their lives. But Linda never did. She wrote letters, hundreds of letters, to the governor's office, requesting resources for cold case investigations, to television producers, hoping to get Abby's case featured on shows about missing persons, to forensic scientists asking about new DNA technologies, to other families offering support and sharing information. David Kincaid handled his grief differently. He became quiet, withdrawn, working long hours at the co-op, throwing himself into physical labor as a way to avoid thinking about what he couldn't fix. He built a small memorial in their backyard, a bench beneath a tree with a plaque bearing Abby's name and dates. Abigail Rose Kincaid, 1988 to 2004. That second date wasn't definite, but after so many years without contact, without any sign she was alive, it seemed necessary to mark the loss somehow. Emma, the younger sister, grew up in the shadow of her missing sibling. She was 11 when Abby disappeared, 26 by the mid-2000s. She went to college, became a social worker, married, had a child of her own, a daughter she named Abigail Rose, ensuring her sister's name would continue. But the disappearance shaped her entire life, made her cautious and protective in ways she might not have been otherwise. Jason, the older brother, struggled with guilt and anger. He felt he should have been there, should have protected his younger sister somehow, even though he'd been hours away at college when it happened. He joined the army after graduation, served 2 tours overseas, came home and became a police officer himself, driven by a need to help people the way no one had been able to help Abby. Detective Holbrook retired from the Illinois State Police in 2012, but before he left, he did something important. He made sure that Abby's case file, particularly the physical evidence, was clearly marked for preservation and regular review. He wrote detailed notes about the DNA sample, emphasizing that future technology might be able to extract a profile from material that was currently untestable. He also made a personal commitment to Linda Kincaid. Standing in her living room on his last day in uniform, he looked her in the eye and promised, "I won't forget Abby. Even in retirement, I'll keep watching. If there's ever a breakthrough, I'll make sure it gets the attention it deserves." Throughout the cold case years, there were moments when the investigation briefly reactivated. In 2009, a hunter discovered skeletal remains in a wooded area about 60 miles from where Abby disappeared. The state police responded, carefully recovering the remains, conducting forensic analysis. DNA testing confirmed the remains were female, approximately the right age range. For 2 agonizing weeks, the Kincaid family waited, suspended between dread and the desperate need for closure. But the DNA didn't match Abby. The remains belonged to a different missing woman from a different case, finally identified after her own years of absence. The Kincaid family returned to their limbo of not knowing. In 2013, a convict serving time for assault claimed he had information about Abby's disappearance, hinting at a deathbed confession from another inmate. Investigators followed up, but the lead went nowhere. The convict, it turned out, was trying to leverage false information for a sentence reduction. In 2016, a documentary series about cold cases featured Abby's story. The episode aired on a national cable network, showing interviews with Linda and David, footage of the memorial site, dramatic recreations of the disappearance. The show generated dozens of tips, which investigators dutifully followed up on. But none led to a breakthrough. The problem with cold cases, especially those without a body, is that they can become frozen in time. Without new evidence, there's often nothing new to investigate. The old leads have been exhausted, The witnesses have been interviewed repeatedly. The physical evidence has been tested to the limits of available technology. All you can do is wait for someone to confess, wait for a body to be discovered, wait for technology to advance. The Kincaid family learned to live in this state of suspended animation. Birthday after birthday passed without Abby there to celebrate. Holidays were marked by her absence. When Emma got married, there was an empty chair at the ceremony with a photo of Abby. When Jason's first child was born, Linda held her granddaughter and wept for the aunt who would never know her. The town itself changed over the years. Young people moved away to cities. Family farms consolidated or were sold to larger agricultural corporations. The high school got smaller. Main Street businesses closed. The library where Abby had worked part-time was renovated, then nearly shut down due to budget cuts, then saved by a community fundraiser. But one thing remained constant: the annual vigil. Even as attendance dwindled to just the immediate family and a handful of faithful community members, Linda Kincaid showed up every October 16th, drove to that spot on County Road 18 North, lit her candles, and refused to let her daughter be forgotten. In the law enforcement community, Abby's case became known as a particularly frustrating cold case, one where investigators were fairly certain an abduction had occurred, where physical evidence existed, but where that evidence simply couldn't be analyzed sufficiently to identify a suspect. It was a case that highlighted the limitations of early 2000s forensic science. But forensic science doesn't stand still. DNA analysis techniques that seemed cutting-edge in 2004 were primitive by 2015. Methods that couldn't extract usable profiles from trace evidence in 2010 became routine by 2020. Throughout the cold case years, trace evidence examiners would occasionally revisit old cases, pulling samples that had been deemed too small or too degraded to test with previous technology. Sometimes these re-examinations led to breakthroughs. Sometimes they didn't. But the practice of periodically reviewing cold case evidence with modern techniques became more common, especially in jurisdictions that dedicated resources to cold case units. Illinois established a formal cold case unit within the state police in 2018, with dedicated investigators and forensic support. The unit's mission was to systematically review unsolved homicides and missing person cases, prioritizing those where biological evidence existed but had never yielded useful results. Abby's case was on their list, but with limited resources and hundreds of cold cases statewide, progress was slow. The case file would be reviewed, noted for future follow-up, then set aside as other cases with more immediate leads took priority. But Linda Kincaid wouldn't let it be forgotten. She maintained contact with the cold case unit, calling quarterly, sending updated information, reminding them that her daughter's case was waiting. Some might call it persistence. Others might call it obsession. Linda didn't care what anyone called it. She was a mother who wouldn't quit. In the spring of 2023, Detective Sarah Chun joined the Illinois State Police Cold Case Unit. She was young, energetic, and had a master's degree in forensic biology in addition to her law enforcement training. She understood DNA analysis in ways that earlier generations of investigators couldn't. Chun was assigned to review a batch of cases from the 2000 to 2005 period, looking specifically for cases where biological evidence had been collected but never successfully profiled. Abby Kincaid's case was in that batch. When Detective Chun pulled Abby's case file and saw the notes about the torn sweater with microscopic DNA traces, something clicked. She'd recently attended a conference where forensic scientists discussed new extraction techniques, methods that could potentially develop full DNA profiles from samples that were previously considered too small or degraded. Chun made a phone call to the state crime lab. "I want to send you something," she said. "I need you to use the latest touch DNA protocols. I think we can get more from this sample than was possible 20 years ago." That phone call, made in May of 2023, would finally crack open a case that had been cold for 19 years. Detective Sarah Chun didn't know Abby Kincaid personally. She'd been a child herself in 2004, growing up in Chicago, far from the rural Illinois community where Abby disappeared. But reading through the case file, studying Abby's school photos, reading the witness statements from family and friends, Chun felt the weight of the unsolved mystery. A 16-year-old girl with dreams and plans, who simply vanished on a familiar road. It demanded justice. The torn sweater sleeve had been carefully preserved in evidence storage for 19 years. Chun reviewed the chain of custody documentation, every time the evidence had been logged in or out, every test that had been attempted. The original 2004 analysis had documented male DNA that didn't match Abby's profile, but the sample was so minute that a full genetic profile couldn't be generated with the technology available at the time. But DNA analysis had evolved dramatically. Touch DNA protocols, methods for extracting and amplifying genetic material from skin cells left by simple contact, had become increasingly sophisticated. What was impossible in 2004 might be routine in 2023. Chun drove to the crime lab in Springfield in June of 2023, personally delivering the evidence and meeting with senior forensic scientist Dr. Robert Kim. She explained what she hoped to accomplish. The original sample was catalogued as insufficient for full profiling, Dr. Kim noted, reviewing the old lab reports. But you're right that we have better tools now. We've successfully extracted profiles from evidence much older than this, and from samples that were initially deemed too degraded. The preservation was good here, stored properly, maintained chain of custody. I think it's worth attempting. Dr. Kim's team used advanced extraction methods, carefully working with the microscopic biological material that had been preserved on the fabric fibers. The process took weeks. DNA analysis isn't instant like television shows suggest. It's painstaking, methodical work requiring patience and precision. In late July of 2023, Dr. Kim called Detective Chun with news. "We got a profile," he said. "A full STR profile, enough markers to run through databases. The sample came through cleaner than I expected." Chun felt her pulse quicken. A full DNA profile meant they could compare it against databases, both the convicted offender database and potentially against genealogy databases if necessary. This was the break the case had been waiting for. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the combined DNA index system maintained by the FBI. CODIS contains genetic profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and forensic evidence from crime scenes across the country. If the person who'd left DNA on Abby's torn sweater had ever been arrested and provided a DNA sample, CODIS would find the match. The search came back with no hits. Whoever the DNA belonged to wasn't in the criminal database. That was disappointing, but not surprising. If the perpetrator had no prior convictions requiring DNA submission, they wouldn't be in the system. But Chun wasn't done. There was another approach: forensic genetic genealogy. This technique, which had become famous for identifying the Golden State Killer in 2018, involved uploading DNA profiles to public genealogy databases where people voluntarily submit their genetic information to learn about their ancestry and find relatives. By comparing the unknown DNA profile against these public databases, investigators could identify genetic relatives of the unknown subject. Then, using traditional genealogical research and police work, they could build family trees and narrow down potential suspects. Chun contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy services. With court authorization and careful attention to privacy laws, the DNA profile from Abby's sweater was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public database used by genetic genealogists. The search identified several distant genetic relatives, people who shared small segments of DNA with the unknown profile, indicating common ancestors several generations back. It wasn't an immediate answer, but it was a roadmap. Throughout August and September of 2023, Chun worked with genetic genealogists to construct family trees, tracing lineages back to common ancestors, then forward again to identify living descendants who might match the DNA profile. The work was intricate, requiring access to birth records, marriage records, census data, obituaries, and other public documents. By October, they had narrowed the possibilities to a handful of men who were the right age, lived in the right geographic area in 2004, and fit the genetic profile. But Chun needed more to make an arrest. She needed to positively identify which of these men matched the DNA. That's when Chun decided to revisit the original investigation file from 2004. She pulled Detective Holbrook's meticulously documented interviews, the list of every man who lived or worked along Abby's bike route. She looked at the names, and there it was. One of the men interviewed in 2004 appeared on the family tree constructed through genetic genealogy. Gary Thornton, the long-haul truck driver who'd been renting a farmhouse about 2 miles from where Abby disappeared. Chun felt ice run through her veins. She pulled Thornton's interview from the original investigation. In 2004, he'd told investigators he was on the road that weekend, hauling a load to Indiana, didn't return home until Sunday. His wife had confirmed he was away. But was that alibi solid? Or was it just what detectives had accepted at the time because they had no reason to doubt it? Chun started digging deeper into Gary Thornton's background. He'd been 44 years old in 2004. He'd lived in central Illinois most of his life, worked various jobs, had been married multiple times. His driving records showed he'd worked for several trucking companies over the years. In 2004, he'd been employed by Midwest Freight Lines. Chun contacted the company, which had been absorbed by a larger corporation but whose records were still accessible. She requested employment records for Gary Thornton from October 2004. What she found was explosive. According to the records, Thornton had been scheduled to drive to Indiana on October 15, 2004. But the trip had been canceled at the last minute due to mechanical problems with the truck. Thornton had been notified on October 15 that he didn't need to leave until Sunday the 17th instead. That meant Thornton had been home on October 16, the day Abby disappeared. His alibi, accepted by investigators in 2004, was based on his scheduled assignment, not on where he actually was. Chun pulled phone records from 2004, archived but still accessible with proper warrants. Cell tower data from Thornton's phone showed his device pinging towers consistent with his home location on the afternoon and evening of October 16. The timeline was coming together. Thornton had been home, not on the road. The farmhouse he'd been renting sat along a road that intersected with County Road 18 North, the road Abby had been traveling. If Thornton had left his house that evening, he would have naturally traveled along the same route. But DNA alone, while powerful, isn't always sufficient for an arrest. Prosecutors want corroboration, want to eliminate alternate explanations. How could Thornton's DNA have gotten on Abby's sweater? Could there be an innocent explanation? Chun considered this carefully. Thornton had no connection to Abby's family. He hadn't been a teacher, coach, or family friend. There was no legitimate reason his DNA should be on her clothing. The sweater had been torn violently. The DNA was found on a portion of the fabric consistent with someone grabbing the sleeve. The forensic evidence pointed to one conclusion. Gary Thornton had physical contact with Abby Kincaid on October 16, 2004, during her disappearance. In November 2023, Chun presented her findings to prosecutors in the county state's attorney office. They reviewed the evidence carefully. The DNA match, the false alibi, the cell tower records, the lack of innocent explanation. Together, they agreed there was probable cause to proceed. But they needed one more thing before arrest. A direct DNA sample from Gary Thornton to confirm the match. The genealogical search had narrowed it to him, but a direct comparison was necessary for absolute certainty. Chun began surveillance of Gary Thornton. He was now 63 years old, still living in rural Illinois, now retired from trucking and working part-time at a hardware store in a neighboring town. He lived in a small house with his third wife, kept to himself, had no criminal record beyond a couple of old traffic violations. To the casual observer, Gary Thornton was just an ordinary older man living a quiet life. But Detective Chun saw him differently. She saw a man who'd lived 20 years with a terrible secret. On December 8, 2023, undercover officers followed Thornton to a diner where he ate lunch. After he left, they retrieved his coffee cup and napkin from his table. The items were bagged as evidence and rushed to the crime lab. Dr. Kim's team extracted DNA from saliva residue on the coffee cup. The analysis took 3 weeks. On January 4, 2024, Dr. Kim called Detective Chun with the results. "It's a match," he said. "Positive identification. The DNA from the 2004 sweater belongs to Gary Thornton." Chun sat in her office for a long moment, letting it sink in. After 19 years, they had their answer. They knew who took Abby Kincaid. Now came the hard part. proving what happened to her and building a case that would stand up in court. But first, Chun had to make a difficult phone call. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she'd found in the case file. After 2 rings, a woman answered. "Mrs. Kincaid? This is Detective Sarah Chun with the Illinois State Police Cold Case Unit. I'm calling about your daughter Abigail's case. We've had a breakthrough." Linda Kincaid had received many phone calls about Abby's case over the years. False leads, dead ends, well-meaning tips that went nowhere. So when Detective Chun introduced herself in January of 2024, Linda's first instinct was to brace for disappointment. But something in Chen's voice was different. There was weight to it, certainty, something Linda hadn't heard before. "We've identified DNA on the sweater found at the scene," Chun said carefully. "We know who it belongs to. We're building a case for arrest." Linda's hands started shaking. David, who'd been sitting across from her, saw the change in her expression and moved closer. 20 years. 20 years of waiting, of hoping, of refusing to give up. And now, finally, something real. "Who?" Linda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who is it?" Chun explained about Gary Thornton, about the false alibi, about how modern DNA technology had finally identified him. She warned that there was still work to be done, evidence to gather, a case to build. But for the first time in nearly 20 years, Linda Kincaid had a name attached to the person who destroyed her family. The investigation moved quickly now. With positive DNA identification, Chun and her team focused on building the strongest possible case. They needed to understand Gary Thornton's background, his movements in 2004, and most crucially, they needed to understand what happened to Abby after he took her. Chun pulled every record she could find. Thornton's employment history, DMV records, property records, financial transactions, medical records, anything that might provide insight. She built a timeline of his life, looking for patterns, looking for anything that might indicate where he could have taken Abby. Thornton's property records from 2004 showed he'd been renting a farmhouse on County Road 22, about 2 miles from where Abby's bicycle was found. The property had a barn and several outbuildings. Chun drove out to look at it, though Thornton hadn't lived there in nearly 2 decades and the property had changed hands multiple times. She obtained a warrant to search Thornton's current residence. On January 23, 2024, a team of investigators executed the search warrant, going through Thornton's house and property methodically. They found computers which were seized for forensic analysis. They found old photos, documents, years of accumulated possessions. In the basement, in a box of old papers, they found something chilling. A newspaper clipping from October 2004, covering Abby's disappearance. Why would Thornton have kept this? There was no innocent explanation. The clipping was carefully bagged as evidence. Computer forensics revealed internet search history from 2004 and the years following. Thornton had regularly searched for news about Abby's case, tracking the investigation, monitoring whether authorities were getting close. It showed consciousness of guilt, an awareness of his crime and fear of being caught. But the most difficult question remained. Where was Abby? Her body had never been found. Without remains, proving murder would be more challenging. Chun knew this case might have to be prosecuted as a kidnapping that resulted in death, even without direct evidence of what happened after Abby was taken. Chun went back to the 2004 investigation, looking at the property where Thornton had lived at the time. The rental farmhouse had a barn and multiple outbuildings, plus acres of surrounding agricultural land. When the property had been searched in 2004, it had been a cursory walkthrough with Thornton's permission, looking for anything obviously suspicious. Nothing had been found. But in 2004, investigators had no reason to focus specifically on Thornton. He was just one of many men living in the area, and his alibi about being out of town had been accepted. The search of his property had been minimal. Chun obtained permission from the current property owners to conduct a more thorough search using modern techniques. In February of 2024, a full forensic team descended on the old farmhouse property with ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and excavation equipment. For 3 days, they searched. The cadaver dogs showed interest in one particular area, a spot behind the barn where the ground elevation was slightly different from surrounding areas. The ground-penetrating radar showed an anomaly in the soil composition at that location. On February 16, 2024, excavation began. 3 feet down, they found disturbed soil that was inconsistent with the surrounding earth. 4 feet down, they found fabric remnants, shreds of denim and cotton, deteriorated but still recognizable as human clothing. 5 feet down, they found what they'd been searching for. Skeletal remains, wrapped in deteriorated plastic sheeting, buried in a hastily dug grave. The remains were carefully excavated and transported to the Forensic Anthropology Lab at Southern Illinois University. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the chief forensic anthropologist, conducted a thorough examination. The skeletal structure was consistent with a female in her mid-teens. Dental records, compared against Abby's dental chart from 2004, provided positive identification. Abigail Rose Kincaid had been found. She'd been less than 2 miles from her family's home for 19 years, buried on the property where her killer had lived in 2004. The forensic examination revealed more grim details. Fractures in the cervical vertebrae suggested strangulation. The hasty burial, the plastic sheeting, the location, all consistent with a panicked attempt to hide a body quickly. Chun pieced together what she believed had happened on October 16, 2004. Gary Thornton had been home that evening, not on the road like he'd claimed. He'd driven along County Road 18 North, perhaps on his way somewhere else, perhaps deliberately. He'd encountered Abby on her bicycle. What motivated him to act, opportunity, impulse, predatory intent, would never be fully known. But DNA evidence showed he'd made physical contact with her, violent enough to tear her sweater. He'd forced her into his vehicle. He'd taken her back to his property. And there, Abby Kincaid's life had ended. She'd been murdered and hastily buried behind the barn, while her family frantically searched and prayed for her safe return. While vigils were held and search parties combed fields, she'd been on that property the entire time. When Thornton's trucking assignment was rescheduled and he finally left on October 17th, he'd already hidden the evidence of his crime. He'd returned home days later, lived in that house for another year before moving elsewhere, carried on with his life, all while Abby lay buried behind his barn. With the remains found and identified, prosecutors could now build a murder case, not just a kidnapping case. The evidence was substantial. DNA on the torn sweater, false alibi, cell phone records placing him at home, newspaper clippings showing he'd tracked the investigation, computer searches revealing his ongoing interest in the case, and most damning, Abby's body found buried on the property he'd occupied in 2004. State's Attorney Margaret Phillips reviewed the evidence and made the decision to proceed with prosecution. On March 1, 2024, arrest warrants were issued for Gary Thornton on charges of first-degree murder and kidnapping resulting in death. The arrest would be dramatic, not because Thornton resisted, but because 20 years had passed, 20 years during which he'd lived as a free man while a family suffered, not knowing. The arrest would close a circle that had been left open for far too long. Detective Chun coordinated with local police departments and the state police SWAT team. They would take no chances. On March 5, 2024, in the early morning hours, they moved in. The arrest operation was planned with military precision. Detective Chun knew they were dealing with a man who'd successfully hidden a murder for 20 years. Someone intelligent enough to construct a cover story and disciplined enough to maintain it for 2 decades. There was no predicting how he might react when confronted. The arrest team assembled at 4:30 a.m. on March 5, 2024. Gary Thornton's current residence was a modest single-story home on the outskirts of a small town about 40 miles from where Abby had disappeared. The house sat on a quarter-acre lot in a quiet neighborhood where nothing much ever happened. At 5:55 a.m., as dawn was just beginning to break, the team moved into position. Detective Chun, wearing a tactical vest despite her role as lead investigator rather than entry team member, stood by the command vehicle, listening to radio communication as officers surrounded the house. At 6 a.m. precisely, the knock came on Thornton's front door. Illinois State Police. We have a warrant for the arrest of Gary Thornton. The door opened almost immediately. Thornton stood there in pajama pants and a t-shirt, a 63-year-old man with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades doing physical labor. He looked at the array of law enforcement officers on his doorstep with an expression that Chun would later describe as resigned, almost as if he'd been expecting this moment. "I wondered when you'd come," Thornton said quietly. He was placed in handcuffs without resistance. His wife, emerging from the bedroom in confusion and shock, was gently moved aside as officers secured the residence. Thornton was read his Miranda rights, placed in the back of a patrol car, and transported to the county jail for booking. At the jail, after he was processed, Chun sat across from Thornton in an interview room. She'd been preparing for this moment, thinking about what she'd say, what questions she'd ask. But looking at this ordinary-seeming older man, knowing what he'd done to a 16-year-old girl, she felt anger rise in her throat. "Gary, you know why you're here," Chun began. "We found Abby. We found her where you buried her, behind the barn on County Road 22. We have your DNA on her clothing. We know what you did." Thornton sat silently for a long moment. His court-appointed attorney, sitting beside him, advised him not to speak. But Thornton seemed to be wrestling with something internal, some calculation about whether the time had finally come to tell the truth. "I'd like to speak with my attorney privately," Thornton finally said. Chun left the room, frustrated but not surprised. Very few suspects confess immediately, especially in cases this serious. But she'd planted the seed. Thornton now knew that the evidence against him was substantial. He knew his secret had been uncovered. And sometimes that knowledge worked on a person's conscience, even after 20 years. While Thornton consulted with his attorney, Chun held a press conference. The media had already picked up on the arrest through police scanners and monitoring of court filings. By 9 a.m., news vans were parked outside the state police district headquarters. Chun stood at a podium, flanked by State's Attorney Margaret Phillips and the commander of the major case squad. Behind them was a large photo of Abby Kincaid, the same school picture that had been shown countless times over the past 20 years. This morning, Illinois State Police arrested 63-year-old Gary Allen Thornton in connection with the 2004 disappearance and murder of 16-year-old Abigail Kincaid. Chen began, her voice steady and professional. "Thornton has been charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping resulting in death." The room erupted with shouted questions from reporters. Chun raised her hand for quiet and continued. "I can confirm that the remains of Abigail Kincaid were recovered last month from property in the county that was occupied by the defendant in 2004. Positive identification was made through dental records and DNA analysis. The investigation utilized advanced DNA technology that was not available at the time of Abby's disappearance." More questions. Chun answered what she could without compromising the prosecution's case. Yes, DNA evidence linked Thornton to the crime scene. No, she couldn't discuss specific details that would be presented at trial. Yes, the Kincaid family had been notified before the arrest. No, there was no evidence of additional victims, though the investigation was ongoing. The press conference lasted 30 minutes. By noon, the story was national news. Cold case solved after 20 years using DNA technology. Illinois man arrested in 2014 murder. Family finally gets answers in daughter's disappearance. At the Kincaid home, Linda and David sat in their living room, the television playing news coverage they couldn't really focus on. Their daughter had been found. After 20 years of not knowing, they knew. The relief and the grief were overwhelming in equal measure. "She was so close," Linda kept saying, tears streaming down her face. "She was so close the whole time, and we didn't know." Emma and Jason had both rushed home, the family gathering together as they'd done so many times over the past 20 years, but this time with a definitive answer instead of questions. They held each other and cried, for Abby, for the years lost, for the finality of knowing she'd never walk through the door again. But alongside the grief was something else. A fierce satisfaction that the person responsible would finally face justice. For 20 years, Gary Thornton had lived free while their family had lived in torment. That injustice was about to be corrected. Back at the jail, after several hours of consultation with his attorney, Gary Thornton made a decision. He wanted to make a statement. Not a full confession, but something. His attorney advised against it, but Thornton insisted. Detective Chun returned to the interview room. This time, with his attorney's reluctant permission, Thornton spoke. "It was an accident," he began, a claim that Chun immediately recognized as a common defense strategy. "Minimize intent suggests things got out of hand. I was driving home. She was on her bicycle. I stopped to ask if she needed help." Chun listened, taking notes, knowing that prosecutors would dissect every word. "She was startled. She tried to ride away. I grabbed her arm, just to reassure her, but she fell, hit her head. Panicked. I thought she was dead. I put her in my truck. I didn't know what else to do." It was a story designed to mitigate culpability, to suggest misfortune rather than malice. But Chun knew it didn't match the evidence. The torn sweater suggested a violent struggle, not someone gently helping a fallen bicyclist. The strangulation injuries suggested murder, not accident. "Where did you take her, Gary?" Chun asked. "Back to my place. I thought I could help her, but she wasn't breathing. I didn't know what to do. I was afraid. I buried her behind the barn." It was a partial admission, acknowledging that he'd taken Abby and buried her body, but framing it as panic rather than murder. Chun knew a jury would have to decide whether they believed this version of events or whether the evidence painted a different picture. After the interview, Chun met with State's Attorney Phillips to discuss Thornton's statement. "It's useful," Phillips said. "He's admitting to taking her and burying her body, even if we don't accept his characterization of it as an accident. His own words place him at the scene and establish that he disposed of her body. Combined with the forensic evidence, we have a strong case." The forensic evidence Chun had compiled was indeed compelling. The DNA on the sweater matched Thornton. The torn fabric suggested violent force. The skeletal analysis showed strangulation, which contradicted Thornton's story of an accidental fall and head injury. The hasty burial suggested consciousness of guilt. The false alibi in 2004 showed prior deception. The newspaper clipping and internet searches showed ongoing awareness and fear of being caught. But perhaps the most damaging evidence was the simplest. Thornton had taken a 16-year-old girl, and she'd ended up dead and buried on his property. No matter what story he told about how it happened, that fundamental fact was undeniable. Phillips outlined the prosecution strategy. They would charge first-degree murder, arguing that Thornton's actions showed intent. Whether that intent was formed the moment he grabbed Abby or developed during whatever transpired afterward didn't matter. What mattered was that a teenager was dead, and Thornton was responsible. The kidnapping charge was equally solid. He'd taken Abby from the roadside, transported her to his property, and she'd never been seen alive again. Under Illinois law, kidnapping resulting in death carried severe penalties, even if the murder charge somehow didn't result in conviction. As the prosecution prepared its case, the defense team for Gary Thornton faced a difficult challenge. Their client had made statements admitting to taking Abby and burying her body. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. The best they could hope for was to argue for lesser charges, perhaps second-degree murder or voluntary manslaughter, arguing that whatever happened wasn't premeditated. But that would be a hard sell given the evidence. And the community, which had waited 20 years for answers, wasn't in a forgiving mood. The arrest of Gary Thornton sent shockwaves through central Illinois. The small rural communities that dot the landscape had lived with the mystery of Abby Kincaid's disappearance for 20 years. It had become part of the local mythology, a cautionary tale, an unsolved mystery that defined the area in some ways. And now, suddenly, there were answers, and those answers were shocking. Gary Thornton wasn't a stranger. He'd lived in the area for years, had worked with many of the local farmers and business owners through his trucking job, had attended community events, had been someone you might pass on the street and exchange pleasant greetings with. The revelation that this ordinary man had murdered a teenage girl and hidden her body for 20 years shattered people's sense of safety and trust. "I worked with Gary for 3 years," one former colleague told reporters. "We hauled grain together, grabbed lunch at the diner, talked about sports. I would never have imagined he was capable of something like this." It makes you wonder who you really know. The reaction in the community was a mixture of relief, anger, and deep unease. Relief that the Kincaid family finally had answers. Anger that Thornton had lived freely while a family suffered. And unease at the realization that a killer had been among them all along, hidden in plain sight. At the local diner where Thornton used to eat lunch, conversations were dominated by the arrest. People traded stories of interactions they'd had with him, scrutinizing past encounters for signs they'd missed, clues they should have noticed. He was always quiet, the diner owner recalled. Polite but not chatty, kept to himself mostly. Looking back now, maybe that quietness meant something. But at the time, he just seemed like a normal guy. The hardware store where Thornton had worked part-time in retirement released a statement expressing shock and emphasizing that they'd had no knowledge of his past. They'd conducted a background check when hiring him, but with no criminal record, nothing had raised red flags. That's one of the chilling aspects of cases like this. How ordinary the perpetrator can seem, how seamlessly they can blend into society, carrying terrible secrets while presenting a normal facade to the world. Thornton's wife, who'd been married to him for 8 years, was devastated. She'd known nothing about his involvement in Abby's disappearance. When police informed her of the charges, she'd collapsed in shock. She'd been living with a man she thought she knew, sharing a home and a life with someone who'd murdered a teenager decades earlier. The betrayal, the horror of that realization, was almost incomprehensible. She immediately filed for divorce and moved out of their shared home, staying with relatives while trying to process the nightmare her life had become. She released a statement through an attorney expressing sympathy for the Kincaid family and emphasizing that she'd had no knowledge of her husband's crimes. The community where Thornton had most recently lived was equally shocked. Neighbors described him as unremarkable, someone who kept his yard maintained, waved hello when passing by, but didn't socialize much. There'd been no signs, no red flags, nothing that would have suggested they were living next door to a murderer. "It makes you feel unsafe in your own neighborhood," one neighbor said. "If someone like that can live among us for years and we don't know, what else don't we know? Who else might be hiding something terrible?" This fear, this sense of violated trust, rippled through communities far beyond Thornton's immediate neighborhood. Parents held their children a little closer. People who'd always felt safe in rural Illinois started locking doors they'd previously left open. The illusion of small-town safety had been shattered. For the Kincaid family, the arrest brought overwhelming emotions. They'd waited so long for this moment, and now that it was here, the reality was both satisfying and painful. Linda Kincaid spoke to reporters from her front porch, David standing beside her, their hands clasped together. "We are grateful to Detective Chun and the Illinois State Police for never giving up on Abby's case," Linda said, her voice strong despite the tears streaming down her face. "For 20 years, we've lived with not knowing. Now we know. Now we know who took our daughter, and he will face justice. That doesn't bring Abby back, but it means her life and her death matter. It means she's not forgotten," David added. "We always knew someone out there knew what happened. We just didn't know who. Now we know his name, Gary Thornton, and he'll spend the rest of his life paying for what he did." The annual vigil that Linda had maintained for 20 years at the site where Abby's bicycle was found took on new meaning in the wake of the arrest. In March of 2024, hundreds of people attended, the largest turnout since the early years after Abby's disappearance. They came to honor Abby's memory, to support the Kincaid family, and to mark the moment when a cold case finally became a solved case. Candles flickered in the darkness along County Road 18 North. People shared memories of Abby, teachers who'd taught her, classmates who'd known her, community members who'd searched for her. The mood was somber but also carried an undercurrent of satisfaction. Justice was finally within reach. Detective Chun attended the vigil, standing quietly at the back of the crowd. She'd only known Abby through case files and photographs, but she'd dedicated months to finding answers for this family. Seeing the community come together, seeing the Kincaid family surrounded by support, made all the long hours worth it. After the vigil, Linda approached Chun and embraced her. No words were necessary. 20 years of pain, of searching, of refusing to give up. It all culminated in this moment. As March moved toward April, the legal process ground forward. Thornton was held without bail, deemed a flight risk and a danger to the community. His attorney filed preliminary motions, standard legal maneuvering, but the defense faced an uphill battle given the strength of the evidence. The grand jury was convened. Over 2 days, prosecutors presented their evidence. The DNA match, the false alibi, the discovery of Abby's remains on Thornton's former property, the forensic evidence showing strangulation, Thornton's own partial admissions. The grand jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a true bill, formally indicting Gary Thornton on charges of first-degree murder and kidnapping resulting in death. The indictment meant the case would proceed to trial. Thornton pleaded not guilty, setting up what promised to be a dramatic courtroom confrontation between the evidence compiled over 20 years and a defense team trying to mitigate their client's culpability. The trial was scheduled for January of 2025, giving both sides time to prepare. The Kincaid family steeled themselves for the difficult process ahead, reliving the worst period of their lives in a public courtroom, hearing details about what happened to Abby that they'd rather not know, but determined to see justice done. The arrest had shocked the community. The trial would force everyone to confront the full truth of what happened on that October evening in 2004. The trial of Gary Thornton began on January 6, 2025, in the county courthouse. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with community members, media representatives, and law enforcement officials who'd worked the case over the years. The Kincaid family sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table. Linda, David, Emma, and Jason, presenting a united front after 20 years of grief. Judge Patricia Whitmore presided, a veteran jurist known for running an orderly courtroom. She'd reviewed the preliminary motions and evidence, understood the significance of this case to the community, and was determined that the proceedings would be fair, thorough, and decisive. Jury selection had taken 3 days. Finding jurors who hadn't heard about the case was nearly impossible given the media coverage, but prosecutors and defense attorneys worked to identify 12 individuals who could set aside preconceptions and evaluate evidence objectively. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 28 to 67, representing a cross-section of Central Illinois residents. In her opening statement, State's Attorney Margaret Phillips laid out the prosecution's case with straightforward clarity. On October 16, 2004, 16-year-old Abigail Kincaid left her friend's house to ride her bicycle home, a 3-mile journey along familiar rural roads. She never arrived home. For 20 years, her family lived with the anguish of not knowing what happened to their daughter. But science, perseverance, and dedicated police work have given us answers. Phillips walked the jury through the evidence they would hear. DNA from the torn sweater, forensic analysis of Abby's remains, cell phone records, the false alibi, and Thornton's own admissions. The evidence will show that Gary Thornton encountered Abby on that road. He made physical contact with her, violent enough to tear her clothing. He took her, and Abigail Kincaid was never seen alive again. Her remains were found buried on property that the defendant occupied in 2004. The evidence is clear, compelling, and conclusive. Gary Thornton is responsible for the kidnapping and murder of Abigail Kincaid. The defense attorney, Marcus Hendricks, faced the challenge of representing a client whose DNA had been found on the victim's clothing and whose property had yielded the victim's remains. His opening statement focused on creating reasonable doubt about intent and premeditation. "This is a tragedy," Hendricks began. "A young woman lost her life, and that is heartbreaking. But the question before you is not whether a tragedy occurred. The question is what crime, if any, my client committed. The prosecution will present evidence, but they cannot present evidence of my client's state of mind or intent on that evening 20 years ago." Hendricks outlined a defense strategy arguing that whatever happened between Thornton and Abby was accidental, that his subsequent actions were driven by panic rather than malice, and that the prosecution's case for premeditated murder was based on circumstantial evidence and assumptions rather than proof. It was a difficult argument to make, but it was essentially the only defense available given the facts. The prosecution began presenting its case. The first witnesses were foundational, establishing Abby's movements on October 16, 2004, and the discovery of her bicycle. Rachel Winters, now 36 years old, took the stand. She'd been Abby's best friend, the last person to see her alive. Testifying was difficult, bringing back memories she tried to process for 20 years. Abby left my house around 5:50 p.m., Rachel testified, her voice steady despite visible emotion. She was happy. We'd been working on a school project. She said she'd see me on Monday. She rode away on her bike, and I went back inside. I never saw her again. Susan Winters, Rachel's mother, testified about confirming to Linda Kincaid that Abby had left at the stated time. David Kincaid testified about searching for his daughter, about finding the bicycle in the ditch, about the beginning of a nightmare that would last 20 years. Deputy Tom Brennan, now retired but called back to testify, described discovering the bicycle and the torn sweater, the launch of the initial investigation, the desperate search that yielded no sign of Abby. Then the prosecution moved to the scientific evidence. Dr. Robert Kim from the State Crime Lab took the stand to explain DNA analysis in terms the jury could understand. DNA is genetic material unique to each individual, Dr. Kim explained. When someone makes physical contact with an object, they can leave behind microscopic cells. In 2004, the DNA sample from Abigail's sweater was too small to analyze fully with the technology available then. But forensic science has advanced significantly. In 2023, using modern extraction and amplification techniques, we were able to develop a full DNA profile from that same sample. Dr. Kim testified about the laboratory process, the safeguards in place to prevent contamination, the statistical certainty of the match. The DNA profile from the sweater matches Gary Thornton's DNA profile. The probability of it being anyone else is approximately 1 in 7 trillion. The defense cross-examined, trying to raise questions about contamination or the possibility of innocent transfer, but Dr. Kim's testimony was rock solid. The DNA was Thornton's, and there was no credible innocent explanation for how it got on a torn piece of Abby's clothing found at the abduction site. Detective Sarah Chin took the stand to walk through the investigation process, from her review of the cold case file to the decision to retest the DNA evidence, to the genealogical search that identified Thornton, to the discovery of Abby's remains. Chen's testimony was detailed and methodical. She explained the false alibi, how Thornton had told investigators in 2004 that he was on the road, but employment records and cell tower data showed he was actually home that weekend. When we examined the defendant's phone records from October 16, 2004, his cell phone was pinging towers consistent with his residence location between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m., exactly the time frame when Abigail Kincaid disappeared. She testified about the search of Thornton's former property, the discovery of Abby's remains, the forensic anthropology examination. Through Chen's testimony, the jury saw the complete picture of a thorough, professional investigation that had ultimately led to Thornton's door. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the forensic anthropologist, testified about examining Abby's remains. This testimony was difficult for the Kincaid family to hear, but necessary. The skeletal remains showed injuries consistent with strangulation, Dr. Morrison explained. Specifically, fractures to the hyoid bone and cervical vertebrae that occur when sustained pressure is applied to the neck. These injuries are not consistent with an accidental fall or impact. They are consistent with manual strangulation. This testimony directly contradicted Thornton's claim that Abby had fallen and hit her head. The forensic evidence showed she'd been strangled, which suggested intentional violence, not accident. The prosecution introduced Thornton's own statement, his claim that Abby had fallen and he'd panicked. But in light of the forensic evidence showing strangulation, that statement now appeared to be a lie designed to minimize his culpability. Retired Detective James Holbrook testified about the original 2004 investigation, the interviews conducted, the evidence collected, the frustration of hitting dead ends. He testified about keeping the case active in his mind even after retirement, about ensuring the evidence was properly preserved for future technological advances. I told Mrs. Kincaid I would never forget Abby, Holbrook testified. And I didn't. Cases like this stay with you. You hope that someday, somehow, there will be a break. I'm grateful that Detective Chun and modern DNA technology finally provided that break. The newspaper clipping found in Thornton's possession and his internet search history were introduced as evidence of consciousness of guilt. Why would an innocent man keep articles about the case and regularly search for updates on the investigation? The prosecution argued it showed Thornton knew he was responsible and was monitoring to see if police were getting close. As the prosecution rested its case after 5 days of testimony, the weight of evidence against Thornton was substantial. DNA evidence placing him in contact with Abby at the abduction site. False alibi showing deception. Cell phone records placing him in the area. Abby's remains buried on his property. Forensic evidence showing strangulation, not accident. His own partial admissions. Evidence of consciousness of guilt. The defense case was brief. Hendricks called character witnesses who testified that Thornton had been a reliable employee, a quiet neighbor, someone who'd never shown signs of violence. But character witnesses are weak evidence against DNA and forensic facts. Hendricks tried to argue that the burial could have been explained by panic, that Thornton had made terrible decisions but not necessarily committed premeditated murder. But the strangulation evidence undermined this argument. Whatever had happened, Abby had been intentionally killed. Thornton himself chose not to testify, exercising his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. This was likely a strategic decision by his attorney, knowing that Thornton's earlier statement had already been introduced and that putting him on the stand would expose him to devastating cross-examination. In closing arguments, Phillips synthesized the evidence into a powerful narrative. Gary Thornton encountered Abby Kincaid on October 16, 2004. He grabbed her violently enough to tear her clothing, leaving his DNA behind. He took her to his property, and there he strangled her. He buried her body hastily behind his barn. Then he lied to police, claiming he was out of town. He lived with his secret for 20 years while Abby's family suffered. But DNA doesn't lie. Forensic evidence doesn't lie. Gary Thornton is guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping resulting in death. Hendricks tried to create doubt, arguing that the evidence showed tragedy but not necessarily premeditation. But it was a weak argument against the mountain of evidence. The jury deliberated for 7 hours over 2 days. When they returned to the courtroom on January 22, 2025, the tension was palpable. The Kincaid family held hands, barely breathing. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Whitmore asked. "We have, Your Honor." The verdict form was handed to the judge, who reviewed it and passed it to the clerk to read aloud. In the matter of the State of Illinois versus Gary Allen Thornton, on the charge of first-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant guilty. Linda Kincaid's sob was audible in the silent courtroom. David held her as she shook with emotion. On the charge of kidnapping resulting in death, we the jury find the defendant guilty. Thornton showed no visible reaction, sitting motionless at the defense table. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. Judge Whitmore thanked the jury for their service and set a sentencing hearing for February. Justice, delayed by 20 years, had finally arrived. The sentencing hearing for Gary Thornton was held on February 14, 2025, Valentine's Day, a cruel irony not lost on anyone in the courtroom. This was the day when the Kincaid family would finally have their opportunity to speak directly about the impact of Thornton's crime, to confront the man who'd stolen their daughter and hidden her for 20 years. Under Illinois law, first-degree murder carries a sentence of 20 to 60 years in prison. Kidnapping resulting in death carries a similar range. Judge Whitmore had discretion in determining the specific sentence within those parameters, and she would consider victim impact statements along with other factors. The courtroom was once again full. The same faces that had attended the trial were there for this final chapter: community members, law enforcement officials, media representatives, and of course the Kincaid family. State's Attorney Phillips addressed the court first, arguing for the maximum sentence. "Your Honor, the defendant's crime was calculating and cruel. He took a 16-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her. He murdered her. He buried her body on his property. And then he lied to investigators and went on living his life while a family suffered 20 years of not knowing. The defendant showed no remorse, no conscience, no compassion for the family he destroyed. The aggravating factors in this case warrant the maximum sentence the law allows." The defense attorney, Marcus Hendricks, had a difficult task. His client had been convicted on overwhelming evidence. The best he could argue was for some degree of mercy based on Thornton's age. He was now 63 years old, and lack of prior criminal history. Your Honor, my client is not a career criminal. Prior to this conviction, he had no criminal history beyond minor traffic violations. While the crime he was convicted of is serious, imposing the maximum sentence on a 63-year-old man is effectively a death sentence. We ask the court to consider a sentence that recognizes both the seriousness of the crime and my client's age and circumstances. But the heart of the sentencing hearing was the victim impact statements. This was when the Kincaid family would have their say, would describe the devastation wrought by Thornton's actions. Linda Kincaid stood first. She'd prepared written remarks but found herself deviating from them, speaking from her heart. Your Honor, I want you to understand what Gary Thornton took from us. He didn't just take Abby's life. He took 20 years of our lives too. 20 years of not knowing. 20 years of birthday cakes with unlit candles. 20 years of holidays with an empty chair. 20 years of watching other families celebrate graduations and weddings and grandchildren, while we had nothing but questions and grief. Her voice broke, but she continued, determination overriding emotion. I kept Abby's room exactly as she left it. For 20 years, I couldn't touch her things because I didn't know if she was alive somewhere, maybe with amnesia, maybe held captive, and I needed her room to be ready for when she came home. That's what not knowing does to a parent. You can't grieve properly because you're stuck hoping. Now we know. Now we can grieve. But 20 years were stolen from us. 20 years that Gary Thornton used to live his life, get married, work jobs, be free. While we were trapped in hell, he was free. That's not justice. That will never be justice. But sending him to prison for the rest of his life is the closest we can get. David Kincaid spoke next, his statement shorter but equally powerful. My daughter was 16 years old. She loved reading, wanted to be a journalist, dreamed of seeing the world. Gary Thornton took all those dreams and buried them behind his barn. He took our family's joy and buried it there too. I hope he spends every day for the rest of his life thinking about what he did, about the life he destroyed, about the family he shattered. And I hope he never knows a moment of peace. Emma, Abby's younger sister, now 31 years old with a daughter of her own named after the aunt she'd lost, spoke about growing up in the shadow of her sister's disappearance. I was 11 when Abby disappeared. I'm 31 now. I've spent more years without her than I had with her. I barely remember what her voice sounded like. I don't remember what it was like to have a normal family, before the disappearance, before the endless waiting. My daughter is named Abigail Rose. She'll never know the real Abby, but she'll know that we never gave up, that justice eventually came, even if it took 20 years. That's Abby's legacy now. Jason, the older brother, fought to control his anger as he spoke. I became a police officer because of what happened to Abby. I wanted to help families like mine, wanted to make sure other cases didn't go cold like hers did. Every time I worked a case, I thought about Abby. And every time I looked at my parents' faces, I saw the pain that Gary Thornton put there. For 20 years, he walked free while my family lived with agony. I'm grateful he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. It's not enough, but it's what we have. Judge Whitmore listened to each statement carefully, her expression grave. When the family had finished, she asked if the defendant wished to make a statement. Thornton stood, his attorney beside him. For the first time since his arrest, he spoke publicly about the case. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I'm sorry for what I did and for the pain I caused. I can't explain why it happened. I can't make it right. But I am sorry. The words felt hollow, inadequate, too little too late. Linda Kincaid stared at him with undisguised contempt. David's jaw clenched. This apology, after 20 years of silence and lies, meant nothing. Judge Whitmore then delivered her sentencing decision. Mr. Thornton, a jury of your peers has found you guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping resulting in death in the case of Abigail Kincaid. The evidence presented at trial showed that you encountered a 16-year-old girl on a rural road in October of 2004. You abducted her, murdered her, buried her body, and then lied to investigators about your whereabouts. For 20 years, You allowed this family to suffer the agony of not knowing while you went on with your life. This court has considered the sentencing guidelines, the evidence, the victim impact statements, and the arguments of counsel. While you had no prior criminal history, the gravity of your crime and the aggravating factors present, the victim's age, the premeditation and concealment involved, and your deception to investigators, warrant a significant sentence. On the charge of first-degree murder, I sentence you to 60 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections. On the charge of kidnapping resulting in death, I sentence you to 50 years, to run consecutively to the murder sentence. That is a total of 110 years in prison. The courtroom was silent as the weight of the sentence sank in. 110 years. For a 63-year-old man, it was effectively a life sentence. He would die in prison, never again knowing freedom. Thornton showed little reaction, having likely expected something similar given the severity of the crimes. His attorney indicated they would file an appeal, which was standard procedure, though unlikely to succeed given the strength of the evidence. For the Kincaid family, the sentence brought a measure of satisfaction. It wouldn't bring Abby back. It wouldn't erase 20 years of suffering. But it meant Thornton would face consequences for the rest of his life. After the hearing, the Kincaid family held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps. Linda, flanked by her family, addressed the assembled media. Today, justice was served. Gary Thornton will spend the rest of his life in prison for what he did to our Abby. That won't bring her back, but it means he'll never hurt anyone else. It means he'll pay for his crime. And it means Abby's life mattered, that she wasn't forgotten. We want to thank Detective Sarah Chun and the Illinois State Police, especially the Cold Case Unit, for never giving up. We want to thank State's Attorney Margaret Phillips and her team, and we want to thank this community for supporting us through 20 years of hell. Abby's story has a tragic ending, but it also shows that cold cases can be solved, that families can get answers, and that justice, even delayed, still means something. Detective Chun, standing nearby, felt a profound sense of closure. She devoted months of her life to solving Abby's case, and seeing the family finally have peace made all the long hours worthwhile. As the crowd dispersed and the media packed up their equipment, the Kincaid family stood together in the winter sunshine. They would visit Abby's grave later. Her remains had been released after the trial concluded, and she'd been buried in the town cemetery with a headstone bearing her name, dates, and a simple inscription: "Beloved daughter and sister, forever in our hearts." For the first time in 20 years, the Kincaid family could move forward, not forgetting Abby, but no longer trapped in the limbo of not knowing. The cold case was solved. The killer was behind bars. Justice had been served. The case of Abigail Kincaid became more than just a solved cold case. It became a symbol of how persistence, advancing technology, and dedicated law enforcement could bring closure to families even after decades of uncertainty. In the months following Gary Thornton's sentencing, the Kincaid case was featured in law enforcement journals and forensic science publications as an example of successful cold case investigation techniques. The use of advanced DNA extraction methods to profile evidence that had been untestable in 2004 became a model for how older cases should be periodically revisited with modern technology. The Illinois State Police Cold Case Unit saw renewed funding and support from the state legislature, with lawmakers citing the Kincaid case as justification for investing in cold case investigations. The success in solving Abby's case created momentum for addressing other unsolved crimes. Detective Sarah Chun became a sought-after speaker at law enforcement conferences, presenting on the Kincaid investigation and the methodologies used to crack the case. She emphasized the importance of evidence preservation, the value of detailed case documentation like Detective Holbrook had maintained, and the potential for genealogical DNA analysis to solve cases where traditional database searches failed. The case also prompted other families of missing persons to renew pressure on law enforcement agencies to revisit old cases with modern forensic techniques. If Abby's case could be solved after 20 years, maybe other cases could too. Cold case units across Illinois and neighboring states reported increased contact from families asking about the status of DNA evidence in their loved ones' cases. Linda Kincaid, who'd spent 20 years as an advocate for missing children and cold case investigations, didn't stop after Abby's case was solved. Instead, She channeled her experience into helping other families navigate the agonizing process of living with uncertainty. She established the Abigail Rose Kincaid Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and funding DNA testing in cold cases. The foundation raised money to help cash-strapped law enforcement agencies cover the costs of advanced DNA analysis, which could be expensive and wasn't always prioritized in tight budgets. Abby's case was solved because evidence was preserved and because Detective Chun had the resources to send that evidence for advanced testing. Linda explained in interviews, "Not every department has those resources. Not every case gets the attention it deserves. If our foundation can help even one family get the answers we finally got, then something good will have come from this tragedy." The foundation also provided support groups and resources for families of the missing, recognizing that the emotional and psychological toll of not knowing a loved one's fate is devastating and often overlooked. David Kincaid, while less publicly active than his wife, volunteered with search and rescue organizations, bringing his painful experience to help in the critical early hours when someone is first reported missing. He knew what those first hours felt like from the inside, and he dedicated himself to helping other families navigate that nightmare. Emma and Jason both continued the work they'd chosen. Emma as a social worker specializing in trauma counseling for families of crime victims, Jason as a police officer now working in the cold case unit of his department. Abby's disappearance had shaped their career paths, and they both found meaning in helping others through their work. The small Illinois community where Abby had grown up dedicated a memorial in her honor. A small park with a bench and a plaque, a place for quiet reflection. It was located near the library where Abby had worked, and local students often went there to read, unknowingly honoring her memory through the activity she'd loved. The annual vigil that Linda had maintained for 20 years continued, but its character changed after the case was solved. It became less about desperate hope for answers and more about remembering Abby's life, celebrating what she'd been, and recognizing that justice had finally been served. The case also prompted discussions about victim services and support for families of the missing. The Kincaid family's 20-year ordeal highlighted how the traditional criminal justice system isn't well-equipped to support families when there's no body, no suspect, and no closure. Organizations working with families of missing persons used the Kincaid case to advocate for better services and resources. In the forensic science community, the case became a teaching tool for explaining the evolution of DNA analysis. Students learning forensic science studied how the same piece of evidence, the torn sweater, yielded minimal information in 2004 but definitive identification in 2023, demonstrating the rapid advancement of the field. The case also raised important questions about how society handles cold cases. Should there be statutes of limitations on murder? Almost everyone agreed the answer was no. The Kincaid case proved that cases could be solved decades later, and perpetrators should face justice no matter how much time had passed. But it also highlighted the resource challenges involved in maintaining cold case units and the difficult decisions departments face about where to allocate limited funding. For the specific community where the crime occurred, there was a collective reckoning with the reality that a killer had lived among them for years. It challenged assumptions about safety, about knowing your neighbors, about trusting your community. Some people became more cautious, more suspicious. Others argued that you can't let one terrible crime destroy the bonds that make communities strong. Gary Thornton's conviction also prompted investigators to look at other unsolved cases in the region. Had he been involved in other crimes? Were there other victims? A thorough review was conducted, examining missing person cases and unsolved homicides from areas where Thornton had lived and worked over the years. No other cases were definitively linked to him, but the possibility couldn't be entirely ruled out. The case resonated nationally as well. True crime documentaries and podcasts featured Abby's story, using it to explore themes of small-town crime, cold case investigations, and the families who refused to give up searching for truth. These media representations helped keep awareness high about the many unsolved cases still waiting for answers. Perhaps most importantly, the case gave hope to other families living with missing loved ones. If Abby's family could get answers after 20 years, maybe others could too. It demonstrated that cases truly are never closed, that evidence can wait patiently for technology to catch up, and that dedicated investigators can bring closure even when it seems impossible. The message was clear: cold cases can be solved. Families deserve answers. And justice, though sometimes painfully slow, never completely forgets. The story of Abigail Rose Kincaid is both heartbreaking and inspiring. Heartbreaking because a 16-year-old girl with dreams and potential was murdered on a familiar road, her life cut short by a moment of terrible violence. Inspiring because her family never gave up, because law enforcement never closed the case, and because advancing science finally provided the answers that justice required. On October 16, 2004, Abby left her friend's house intending to ride her bike home for dinner. She never arrived. For 20 years, her family lived in the particular agony of not knowing. Not knowing if she was alive or dead. Not knowing what had happened. Not knowing who was responsible. That not knowing is a special kind of torture that only families of missing persons truly understand. But Linda Kincaid refused to let her daughter become just another statistic, another cold case file gathering dust. She kept pushing, kept advocating, kept Abby's name alive. And when Detective Sarah Chun pulled that case file in 2023 and saw an opportunity to use modern DNA technology, that persistence paid off. The torn sweater that had been preserved for 19 years finally revealed its secret. Gary Thornton's DNA was there, microscopic evidence of his guilt. The genealogical search, the old employment records showing his false alibi, the cell phone data, and ultimately the discovery of Abby's remains on his former property. All of it came together to solve a case that had seemed unsolvable. In February of 2025, Gary Thornton was sentenced to 110 years in prison. He'll die behind bars, never knowing freedom again. It's the justice that Abby deserved, that her family deserved, that the community deserved. This case teaches us several important lessons. First, that cold cases aren't truly cold. Evidence waits. Technology advances. Determined investigators can find answers even decades later. Families and law enforcement agencies should never assume a case is too old to solve. Second, evidence preservation is crucial. If the torn sweater hadn't been carefully stored and maintained with proper chain of custody, the DNA couldn't have been tested decades later. Every piece of evidence in every case, no matter how insignificant it seems at the time, could be the key to future answers. Third, families matter. Linda Kincaid's relentless advocacy kept Abby's case from being forgotten. Her annual vigils, her letters, her contacts with law enforcement, all of it kept pressure on the system to find answers. Families of missing persons should never feel guilty about pushing for attention to their loved one's case. Fourth, collaboration between different investigative approaches, traditional police work, modern DNA analysis, forensic genetic genealogy, can crack cases that no single method could solve alone. The future of cold case investigation lies in combining these tools. And finally, this case reminds us that perpetrators who think they've gotten away with murder can never truly rest. DNA doesn't deteriorate at the same rate as human memory. Physical evidence can outlast alibis and lies. Gary Thornton lived 20 years thinking he was safe, but the evidence was waiting. Justice was waiting. For the Kincaid family, life will never be what it would have been if Abby had made it home that October evening. They'll never stop missing her, never stop wondering what she would have accomplished, who she would have become. But they have something now that they didn't have for 20 years. Answers. They know what happened. They know who was responsible. And they know that person is paying for what he did. Abby's grave in the small-town cemetery is visited regularly by her family. The memorial park dedicated in her honor sees students and community members who stop to read her story and remember. The foundation bearing her name helps other families get the forensic testing that might solve their cold cases. Abby's legacy continues, not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for justice. This case is a testament to everyone who refused to give up, the family who kept fighting for answers, the detectives who stayed with the case across decades and career changes, the forensic scientists who kept advancing their field, and the cold case unit that finally brought all the pieces together. Every year in America, thousands of people go missing. Some are found quickly. Some are never found at all. And some, like Abby, wait years or decades before their stories finally come to light. Each of those missing people is someone's daughter, someone's son, someone's sister or brother. Each of them deserves the same determined effort that finally brought answers in Abby's case. If you have any information about an unsolved case, a missing person, or a cold case in your area, please come forward. You might have the piece of the puzzle that law enforcement needs. You might be the reason another family finally gets the answers they've been desperately seeking. No detail is too small. No memory is too uncertain. Call the police. Call the FBI. Call the cold case unit. Make the call. Because somewhere right now, there's a family like the Kincaids, living with the agony of not knowing. There's evidence waiting in a storage room, waiting for someone to look at it with fresh eyes or new technology. There's a detective like Sarah Chun about to pull a file and see something everyone else has missed. Justice in the Abigail Kincaid case took 20 years, but it came. Came because people didn't give up. Came because science advanced. It came because one detective saw an opportunity and pursued it. And it came because the evidence, carefully preserved, was waiting to tell its story. Cold cases can be solved. Families can get answers. And killers who think they've escaped justice can be held accountable, no matter how many years have passed. This has been the story of Abigail Rose Kincaid, a 16-year-old girl from rural Illinois whose disappearance in 2004 became one of the state's most haunting cold cases, until modern DNA technology and dedicated investigation finally brought her killer to justice in 2025. Her case is solved, but there are thousands more waiting for their moment, waiting for their Detective Chun, waiting for their breakthrough. Those cases need our attention, our resources, and our commitment that no victim will ever be truly forgotten. Remember Abby. Remember that justice is worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth pursuing no matter how many years have passed. Thank you for listening. Until next time.